Next on the agenda, we have the agency roundtable. We could get Nichole and Geib, Andy Bennet, Phil Clements, and Blair Heptig up to the front so we can grill you with all sorts of questions. Okay, so I think the general format here would be that we've got a set of starter questions that we'll kind of get the panel lubricated with, and then if you guys have follow-up questions that pop in your head during this, we'll go ahead and have you guys kind of fill in with additional questions. We'll start with number 3. What is one of the obstacles that you've had to overcome toward pavement preservation?
Yeah, we've had a few obstacles. Probably one of the recent one was our 1R agreement with the use of federal funds. We also tied in, ourselves with our state-funded preservation projects also, but it kind of limited what we could do under our 1R design standards. So that was a little bit of an impact for us. We have to go to 3R standards on a few of the treatments that we maybe wouldn't look at 3R standards with previously, but just requires some extra design review and a little extra planning, but it's not a huge obstacle.
I guess in South Dakota, I think one of the biggest challenges is we have 12 different areas across the state that we have to coordinate with, and you're talking 12 different personalities, and they all have slightly different views on what preservation is. So as a pavement management engineer, you have to kind of keep the vision going, if you will, for that, and make sure they stay on track. But I see this, that's probably one of our biggest challenges, is just, staying coordinated and staying focused when it comes to preservation.
I just think back to 30 years ago when we started our program, and it was really getting over the worst first mentality that we had at that time. But our program's been in place for quite a long time. We do have the issue, like Phil said, that we have some different opinions from region to region on fixes, but we do try to have some continuity there with input from the central office.
All of the projects that we're letting go through the STIP-CHIP process, the statewide transportation improvement program, and that's a very detailed, we plan projects out 11 years in advance almost, and those projects get into the plan. So if you come up with new treatments, new ideas, money's been programmed and locked up. One thing the districts have been doing is they have a few set-asides in their program, and one of them is a preventive maintenance or a road construction category that can be used for our surface treatment. So the chip seals and microsurfacing are scheduled and planned in a shorter schedule and not in the STIP individually. So as long as that money stays available, if something bad happens, winter budget goes way over, another project has some problems, some of that preventive maintenance type funding can get used up for other projects. But I think overall our districts are doing a real good job with all types of preservation activity.
Yeah, so in Saskatchewan, I think one of our biggest challenges has been in the last few years is just a restructuring within the organization and shifting of folks around. So you get some disconnects between the folks that have that knowledge base and understanding of the preservation treatments and selection. And so we've been working on doing a better job of documenting, particularly focusing on project selection. With that turnover, we went from being regionalized in how we do our pavement modeling as well as project selection and funding. So in 2018, we changed to a provincial approach. So we just have one provincial team now that does all of that. And so our projects are prioritized provincially, which has helped a lot with making sure we're doing the right treatment at the right time. In the past, we were more making sure everybody had projects, and now it's more just focused on what are the conditions of those roads. So that's been great, but we've also seen a lot of retirements and new folks coming in all across the organization. So we had, in the last couple of years, we've had some just projects go bad, and it was really just because of that project selection. So Our team didn't catch it. When it went to our construction team, they had new folks, they didn't catch it. The contractors, new to that particular type of treatment, they didn't have the experience to catch it. So those are kind of, and then once you do have those failures, then those questions start being asked about, what are we doing? So those questions start to come up. So that's really our challenges today.
So a question related to getting these in asset management. So one challenge that I've seen in Missouri is a district will have so many miles that they need to plan for or treat in each year of the asset management plan, and it's a 10-year rolling strategic plan. And we haven't really captured the benefit in the asset management plan that preventative maintenance treatments give. And so what I mean by that is the districts are still being charged, those are miles that you touched. And so if you put a new overlay on and then 3 years, 4 years later, you're coming in and doing a preventative maintenance treatment, the district is still getting charged with, well, you're touching those miles again. And how do we get our asset management plan to recognize that the overall cost is going to be cheaper if you look at it over the life of what that first treatment's going to be, but for a 10-year strategic plan, it's just looking at you touch this many miles. Is it that for a preventative maintenance that you could give it a fraction of a mile and let them plan it that way to get their miles in? Or have any of you come across that kind of problem?
I see Jerry shaking his head no. I think that might be just related to states differ in their asset management techniques. Best way to put it?
Yeah, I don't get into the asset management plan stuff very much, so I don't know how much I can comment on that. But we've got kind of a target mileage for the statewide each year. We shoot for about 1,200 miles on our, 9,500 mile system with some type of what we would consider a preservation treatment. We don't count them differently. A chip seal counts the same as a 1.5 milling inlay. But we need the flexibility. Our funding originally was set off a 3/4 inch, what we used to call a machine laid seal in the 70s and early 80s, and that kind of set the baseline for our program in terms of funding. But we needed that flexibility to have some higher end fixes and then some lower end fixes. So we still have that same goal of hitting about 1,200 miles with our substantial maintenance program. So I don't know how we capture that in an asset management plan, but it's a valid point that, you could maybe do things in a more economical way with, more treatments than as opposed to one heavy treatment.
In South Dakota, we don't necessarily program off of number of miles. In our STIP, we have a separate funding category, a state funding category that we use for pavement preservation, and it is a flexible category. In other words, because of the nature of how overlays come in, for instance, with asphalt, you might have some years that are more than others, and with that flexibility, you're able to program those preventive maintenance, those chip seals, those route and seals, with those ebbs and flows in the resurfacing realm. We're rather supported with that, and we're able to somewhat project, how much we're going to spend, and we can give our upper division a little bit of heads up. Okay, we're going to see that we have a little bit more that we're going to need to do in the coming years. So, just kind of flexibility on that end. We're more centralized in how we control the budget with that, but like I said, the flexibility is there.
For those of you that have a fully implemented pavement preservation program, who was your champion? And then I'm going to add in a couple other little follow-up questions. Where are they located in your organization? And do you have plans if that person was ever to leave? Do you have a follow-up person that's going to take that lead over?
I would have to say for us, we've had a pavement preservation program in place for quite a number of years. It supersedes the amount of time I've been with with the organization. That's over 24 years. But it has evolved over the years, and probably our most current champion that we have is our operations division director, which would be Mr. Craig Smith. And he was instrumental in starting in 2010 with putting together a pavement preservation guide that was more geared toward the operations side, but at the same time, control of the programming for the projects for preservation was given to the pavement management side of things rather than on the operations side, because then we could model and look at where the needs would be for preservation over the years. So I can't say at this, I mean, Craig Smith is still with us, and he is a champion in preservation, but I think we have more of a team with, I say that I wear the hat of the preservation engineer, but it's more of the preservation team. When you look at myself, you look at the region and area engineers that I work with, and even right down to the region designers that put these projects together. We're always in constant communication about the projects that get programmed and then eventually let for preservation.
I would say KDOT has several champions, but our lead champion would be our Chief of Construction and Materials. Formerly, it was our Chief of Construction and Maintenance. We've done some reorganization about 5 years ago, but it definitely takes, our pavement management engineer, our district engineers. They're all providing a lot of input into what becomes our final selection of roads and actions. So do we have a succession plan? Nothing formally, but I think we've kind of got it ingrained into our culture, into our legislature, and even into our public that preservation is needed. There's a lot of public support for it. So I don't think we're at risk of losing funding. There's just going to be some continuity issues. I think our big scare right now is that our pavement management leader leaves because we're kind of unique in our pavement management system. It's an in-house thing, and it's pretty old, and we're trying to get it updated to where if he does retire, he'll be able to pass the baton, because if he leaves now, we're in pretty bad shape.
We started our program in 1992, and many of you may know Larry Galehouse was an engineer that was championing the CPM program. At that time, he retired in 2002, and we've had several CPM engineers since then, but he was the original champion, and the successors have been champions of the preventive maintenance program. So I'm on my 5th CPM engineer now.
In Minnesota, it'd be hard to put one name on the preservation program champion. Kurt Turgeon works in our central office, and he's our pavement engineer. We've got the pavement management unit is under him, so the pavement management unit is working with the targets we have for good and poor pavements, and then they work with the districts. And we're fairly decentralized, so the districts have a lot of choice in what pavement projects they do. So there's probably not an individual champion, but a lot of people that have been involved in the program. And also for our surface treatments, Tom Wood was our champion, that he really improved the chip seal specification and did a lot of work on that over the years. Tom worked in research and probably did as much, I'd call it, implementation, boots on the ground work with the districts than technical research. And then Tom also started our microsurfacing program, looking at microsurfacing and developing that specification for us. And maybe one quick story on the chip seal specification, and I've seen it a lot, and when we put up the pictures of that ideal chip seal, and all the stones are one size and they're all next to each other, and even in the AASHTO spec, which I'm not a big fan of, the MnDOT specification says I'd like, on this FA2, I want 100% pass in the 3/8 sieve. The next size sieve, most people have a 90 to 100% or an 80 to 100%. MnDOT said 0 to 100%. If if a manufacturer came to me and I said, I've got 100% pass in the 3/8 and only 15% pass in my next sieve, it probably wouldn't meet a lot of everybody's specs, but it's the perfect size chip. You know, that individual chip, so everyone should, I'd encourage you to take a look at your chip seal specifications and see how you've set up your sieve sizes. So MnDOT's, it's a little different. It kind of looks funny when you look at it, but I think it allows you to get an individual chip. And if that's what we'd like for great performing chip seals, I think it's a good idea.
So in Saskatchewan, we started our kind of journey into pavement preservation, and asset management has been basically interchangeable language for us. And that was around the late 90s, early 2000s. So the folks that championed at the time have long since retired. But each of our regions had established dedicated staff for pavement preservation. And if you look at our organization today, we have folks that came up through the preservation part of the organization and are now on our executive team. So if I look at the layers of folks above me in the organization, all of them came up through as, you know, entry-level pavement preservation planners. And so recently, a few months ago, I had presented our 2-year preservation plan and our 5-year repaving reconstruction plan with our executive team. And I really didn't have to say anything because everyone in the room has had that experience, understands the challenges and the issues, and understand the treatments. So the culture's, the culture's there in our mystery, which is pretty exciting to see. We do have a few more folks that have been at it for quite a while that will be retiring, but you know, we have a lot of strong folks coming up that have experience. So,
Any follow-up questions from the audience? All right, we'll move on to, let's go to, is there any particular treatment that your state is struggling to implement?
I think for us, it's the longitudinal joint treatments that we've had an issue trying to get those in place, the joint bond, the J-band, some of those treatments. We do have a longitudinal joint density spec for our HMA, and we've had a lot of discussions with HMA industry on this, and we've done some experimenting with it, but I really would like to see us implement more of that, and I think we've been a little bit slow to the table on that.
Yeah, I would say maybe a couple of treatments that we've struggled with were our cold-in-place recycling. We used to do quite a bit of it in Kansas. We rehabilitated most of I-70 west of Salina, so the western half of the state, with cold-in-place recycling back in the 80s and 90s. But really, we've lost a lot of that experience and that contractor availability, at least locally. So that, as we moved towards an engineered emulsion with that product, it just drove up the price. It improved performance drastically, but it kind of put it in a different category of where some people thought it was a less desirable action, and it never really came back. So that's been one of the treatments we've kind of struggled with to get back. The other one is probably microsurfacing. We don't do a lot of it. We used to do a whole lot of it, again, similar to cold in place, but we kind of lost that knowledge. We have one contractor mainly that does most of the work. All of the aggregate comes from southeast Kansas, northeast Oklahoma. I don't know if you guys are facing similar challenges to what we are in Kansas recently with the trucking issues. We run, a lot of rural areas. We don't have stationary facilities. We don't have a lot of aggregate out west. So having that one source of aggregate for our micro has been kind of makes it higher price, right? Having to drag it to western Kansas. So we've been looking at things like adding wrap into the micro to try to make it a little more desirable to the district folks who do have input on the action selections.
I would have to echo that cold-in-place recycle is something that we've struggled with in South Dakota. A lot of it has to do with there was some past failures with that treatment, and then because of that, the head of our Materials and Surfacing Office basically said no more. But that might change here in the next year or two because we have a new young individual that is now the head of our Materials and Surfacing Office, and he's a little bit more open to trying some of these treatments and, you know, finding a good candidate, and that's kind of half the battle too. So I guess more to come on that, but that we do kind of struggle with that.
One of the new things Minnesota's looking at is a slurry specification, and we've slowly been developing it, microsurfacing versus a slurry. Our micros perform well, but we're starting to look at a slurry, and it takes time to go through the process. We do have a new void-reducing asphalt membrane specification. It was a 2-page spec, and I worked on it a lot with our bituminous office, and it took us about a year to get it done. And some of that's probably on me because I would send it down to the CO and I wouldn't hear back from them for a while. And I didn't want to push them too hard, but we finally got it done. So, you know, the new specification development, there's always, as I like to say, MnDOT's like the big ship in the ocean. It takes a little while to turn it, so you just got to get it pointed in the right direction.
Yeah, so we have a couple in Saskatchewan that we're working on right now. We had hired a consulting firm to help us out with putting together some specifications for hot in place. We haven't done hot in place for a number of years. We had some projects about 10 years ago, I'm going to say, that it just didn't get off the ground. So now we have some specs, and we had a few projects that the consultant looked at for candidates, and they weren't a good fit. So now we're looking for candidates. So that's coming for us for hot in place. Another one that we are working on are specifications for contractors to do rejuvenator fog seals for us. We've been doing those with our in-house maintenance crews, but we're challenged with when the crews get out onto our high volume roads, they're just really not set up very well for accommodating traffic. So we haven't been programming those treatments on our higher traffic roads. So we want to have some contractors come and do that work for us. So so we're just in the process of getting some specs together for that, and hopefully have some tenders for next season.
I have a question because I was talking to some folks earlier this week, and it's been great conversations in the breaks and everything. Probably learn a lot there. I hope everybody else does too. But as far as project selection, I know you mentioned something about that 5-10 years ago. That was a big issue because there weren't enough experienced people out there to look at project selection, proper selection for preservation treatments. And now with the new pavement management programs and stuff, I guess I'd want to know, are you guys comfortable with your states and provinces that you have a good setup for properly choosing the right pavements for the right treatment at the right time?
Yeah, so in Saskatchewan, we just actually changed our software for our pavement models. So we're now using Dayton's DTIMS. So it's been about 2 years now. So our first round, it was not a good match with the projects being generated versus what we were seeing on the road. But we've been working quite a bit to just calibrate those models and try to get a much better fit. So still a work in progress. But we do, we tend to generate, we do a lot of work in the office when we see the projects coming out of the models. So Fugro does our data collection for us. They have a really nice dashboard, iVision platform where we can go and look at right-of-way images, all the condition information. So we use that a lot. So we'll go through, we'll get a list of projects, and we'll run through all of them in iVision to see if what the model's saying makes sense. And then we go back through the history. What kind of maintenance have we been doing on there? How much money are we spending? What's the last treatment? So we do a lot of work in the office now, which is great. And then we go out on into the fields, and we try to get experienced people out there. If it's something we know, like the person who's responsible for doing those field checks, if they're not we know it's going to be one that will need a more experienced eye on making that call. And then they'll also meet with the maintenance, like the district's folks in the field to look at the project as well. And that seems to be helping a lot. And we're trying now to sort of feed those selections back into how the project's being generated in the model. So we've just added the age of the pavement into our models. We never had pavement age before as a trigger. So yes, it's a work in progress though, so we're not there yet.
I think most of the projects are fairly reasonable, and I think if you took all the materials engineers across Minnesota and gave them a project, would they all select the same treatment? I think you're going to get a tight grouping, but slight differences. So overall, I think we're doing a good job. The districts do pick them. If we look at an individual project, you might question, should it be 2 inches? Could we do a CIR here? But and most times we look at one project, when you look at the whole district and their schedule and their program, how many dollars, what fit with what, then you understand that this is what we had money for, and this is what we're doing. But so sometimes on rare occasions, and I'd have to go back a long time for a district project, I remember, they wanted to do like a 2-inch mill or something. That's what they had money for. The materials engineer said, we've got some weaker asphalt in this thick layer. This might not be a good idea. And he was told, no, that's all we can do. Well, they went out there, they milled it off. When the truck traffic from construction got on the project, that layer started fell apart, and then they had to write a big supplemental agreement. So maybe that wasn't the right project, but when you balance everything that goes into selecting the pavement, I think we're doing a pretty good job.
We've had a good pavement management system and collected data. I think our challenges several years ago was that we didn't turn that data around quickly enough, and especially for preventive maintenance, I think that's important that you have recent data. Now I think they're not doing 100% of a project. They're looking at the consistency, and they're turning the data around quicker for us. So we use it, but we don't use it as a black box to make our selection. We try to get a look at all the projects and get a group together from central office and from the regions to look at it and make sense of the selection that we're doing. So
Kind of how it works in Kansas is we input our funding going forward into our pavement management system, and it's going to kick out a list of projects. It's going to say here's your year 1 actions, here's the year 2 actions, here's the year 3 actions. And so it generates a candidate list of projects going forward. We send that out to the districts. The districts have some flexibility in what they select, but they're somewhat constrained by that output. They have to select, for the upcoming year, they have to select roughly, I think it's 50% minimum of the action or the locations output by the pavement management system. They can I think it's something like 66% they need to meet, either be in year 1 or year 2 for that next year. And then we also have a requirement, it's like 75% for year 1, 2, 3. So they're constrained somewhat by the output in terms of location, but not the action selection. Our models are a little out of date, and I don't know if we can account for all the things that we consider in our models in terms of action selection. I don't get into that with pavement management, but we get a group together, so we'll send our candidate list to the districts. They're going to put their preference on location and actions and rank them, and then we're going to evaluate our funding and go out and look at the projects, kind of like Jerry was talking about. We pay attention to a lot of the action history and look at, are we going to be milling 1/2 inch from an interface of a previous overlay? We try to avoid things like that. If we're going to do a hot in place recycle, same type of thing. We consider some of that in our action selection. So that's another reason to move towards a new pavement management system also, is we've not been able to update those models that kind of tell us which action would be best to perform. So that's all part of the effort. But yeah, I'm pretty confident in our system and how it helps us select our locations.
With our pavement management system, and I've been involved with it for the 24 years that I've been with South Dakota DOT and with DTIMS, and with any other system that you look at, I don't care who it is, you get a certain amount of trust with the system, but you also have to verify, and our litmus test for that is we do go through an inspection process with the projects that are kicked out of the pavement management system, but then we also kind of do a blind, the regions don't see my lists, and they submit to me what their needs are across their regions or areas, and then I'll compare with what I have, and normally those needs will match up. We have a pretty good, I would probably say 75 to 80% of the time, we see a pretty good match. 5 to 10% of the time, there's something new either from me or from them, and then the rest of it is we might be looking at a project we've already programmed on that. But we get into a van, we bounce around in a van across the state with the region engineer, the area engineer, we have the surfacing design engineer with us, and then we have what's called our transportation planning engineer, which is basically the person that once they get the project in our STIP, then they scope those projects and then push them to design. So everybody gets a look, everybody gets an input in that from the final notes. And if you look at our final notes, you'll see location information, condition information, but then as you go down the line, you'll see what the pavement management recommends, timing, treatment, and then right after that, you see the materials recommendations from the design. So it's a pretty involved process, and we involve a lot of people in that process for that final candidate project that's pushed forward to the STEP.
What role do you see sustainability playing in your overall states and in your pavement preservation strategies like EPDs and all that stuff? That seems to be a hot button in a lot of things I go to. So what are your guys' thoughts on how that's affecting you now and in the future?
Good question.
I guess to start that off as the first thing in the pavement management realm, we need to figure out how we're going to model it mathematically or whatever. I see that as the challenge right now is, just coming, if we're going to do that, if we're going to go down that road, is being able to model it in our systems.
Right now, Minnesota isn't doing any type of EPDs, but our pavement engineer is heavily involved in there, so we know it's coming and we're getting ready. Now, how that impacts project selection and treatments, I'm not quite sure yet. I kind of think most of the things we're doing are somewhat reasonable, environmental, the recycling, all that, but how, if EPDs start changing projects, then I think it'll be interesting.
Okay, so I'm ignorant. What's an EPD?
Environmental Project Declaration.
Oh, okay. Yeah, okay. I don't feel bad then. Yeah, on the environmental end of things, Saskatchewan, about 2 years ago, we hired a consultant to come in and help us out with a RAP management strategy. So they worked with us for about 6 months and kind of just, because we have stockpiles of RAP that are sitting all over the place, and our some changes provincially with our environmental regulations were that those piles are now environmentally regulated, so we have to inventory them, and we can only have them on the ground for a certain period of time. So we need to have a plan for all of our piles, and we do have some quite massive piles and some that are just big hunks of asphalt that we need to get in there and crush down and then figure out where to put those into projects. So that is one thing we're working on right now. So.
I don't know if I have a favorite question right on here, but I do have a favorite pavement story that, performance-wise, that maybe I'll switch over to. Interstate 394 is a major commuter route from Minneapolis to the west. It was the last interstate we built in Minnesota. It was open to traffic in 91, but it was built on top of US 12, so it was built under a lot of traffic. In Minnesota, an asphalt pavement has a 20-year design life from an easel standpoint, the number of loads. So we calculate the loads we expect, get our bituminous layers, aggregate base under there, and that's our design. After we open it to traffic, let's forget about kind of the loads and the pavement design life and say, how do we want this pavement to perform? So 91, we opened the traffic. The smoothness wasn't fantastic, but it was certainly acceptable because of all the traffic it was constructed under. At year 13, we did a mill and overlay 1.5 inches. It got up to about the same smoothness that it was when it was open. Paul Noland, who's in the back with our MnDOT group, in 2016, I think that's, yep, he did an ultra-thin bonded wearing course, or he did a micro milling and ultra-thin bonded wearing course on the project. So it's now 25 years old, and when they were done with that, that road was smoother than when it was brand new and opened. So for me, if I was, managing a district or materials, I want to keep my interstates in good ride. And this pavement for 25 years may have 1 or 2 years that the ride dropped from that, 95 inches per mile measurement, which is the good to fair for most places, into fair. And that's how I'd like to maintain pavements. Just when they're good, keep them good. I think Chuck's presentation on the thin lays, you're putting in 3/4 to 1.5 inches down and getting many, many years, of good life. That's the way to go.
Open question season. The discussion previously about your programs and how much you were treating made me think about that there might have been a benchmarking study and gap analysis and other things that we really can't talk about. But one of the things I was wondering, it seemed like a lot of programs focus on the number of miles they treat with preservation and maybe miles with different treatments. And it seems to me that that's missing the point in many cases, that the first question would be, that you need to answer would be, how many miles of your network need preservation? And so, part of my open question is, do any of you look at your network in terms of preservation needs, sort of dividing into needs preservation, needs rehabilitation or reconstruction? And then secondly, in terms of monitoring the progress in your program, do any of you look at, we hit X% of our preservation needs with preservation treatments? So, I'm wondering if, say, that's a best practice, or what you think of that, whether you're doing it already, whether it could be implemented, and hopefully there's a clear enough question in there.
That's a tough one to answer. And so if we looked at the pavement management system in Minnesota and said, which project, which pavement record needs a preservation, I'm not sure how we would define that. If in Minnesota, and when I think Missouri was talking, they want 90% of their interstate good, 80 of the others. Minnesota's interstate, so we have goals for interstate, non-NHS, and other NHS in the middle there. And ours are 70, 65, and 60 is how much percent we want good. So the pavement management is running through and cranking to hit these targets. So I would think, does that mean it's a preservation project? If we're hitting the targets, I think we're doing the right thing. Maybe our targets are a little low. Sorry. Targets are are our targets a little low in Minnesota? Missouri's were certainly higher than ours for interstate good, and we have some poor ones. So I think we've probably got a reasonable program of preservation projects. If we want to talk, cracking and ride targets and when should you start that preservation project?
I mean, internally, yeah, we do generate information around like what our backlog is on our different levels of service in terms of we need to do this much. This much right now could be sealed or microsurfaced or repaved. That it doesn't really get too far though outside of our kind of our group and our team. So I think internally the folks that you know are working with the pavement preservation programs, they understand all those numbers and kind of what those challenges are, and we do communicate that through to our executive. But the folks that track, you know, sort of our scorecard on how we're doing, they really just want to see how many kilometers of work we're putting on the market for different types of treatments, and that's kind of it. We also externally we only report on what our IRI numbers are. We're moving to PCI reporting, but yeah, I kind of have that conversation with the folks that prepare our financial submissions for funding, and they just want very simple. Very simple, how many kilometers and what's the cost of doing the work and what's inflation and that kind of thing. So
To answer your first question, this year, each one of our region has a pavement management engineer, and we did have one region, I thought, that put together a presentation that was really good on that needs versus what are we hitting. And I would like to see every region do that, because most just say we need more money in preservation to handle what we have, but it's really good to put numbers to that. So not statewide, we haven't done that, but we've started to see that on the region level.
I think I can answer maybe part of one of the questions in there. Yes, we do have a mileage target, and I understand your point about maybe that's not the right approach. Well, we have maybe some other different conditions that we face in Kansas that maybe some others do not. I'm not sure. A lot, you know, roughly half of our system, so what, 5,000 miles roughly, the pavement was never designed. It was a trail in the early teens that some farmer maintained locally that turned into it was a gravel road maybe, and somebody came in and put something like a chip seal or something similar to it in the 20s, and now over time we've added slurries or chip seals that have been built up. They got a lot of transverse cracks in them that we're dealing with. So we're trying to keep those things alive with preservation. There are a lot of like farm type routes. They're never going to come up on the big reconstruct. Going through local consult or going through our models for, economic needs, safety, pavement condition. It's never really going to get up that list to say, hey, this road needs to be reconstructed. So we've tried to Band-Aid these things along for years and years with preservation actions. And we've been fairly successful at it. Now what we run into is if you do a mill and inlay and it lasts 3 years and it's falling apart, and then we do it again and it falls apart again, maybe we go, wow, this thing's probably beyond preservation, right? We need to really advocate and try to get this thing pushed up the rankings and get it major rehabilitation or reconstruction. So for us, that mileage target, I think it's an approach, maybe not the right approach, but I think it's kind of what we have with our conditions in Kansas to deal with.
And kind of to address that, I kind of look at how South Dakota sets up their STIP and then how we set up our pavement management system, and being able to look at our data and track what we've done and what we could be doing. And first of all, looking back, and we have our STIP set up into different funding categories for our state highways. We have our interstate, major arterial, minor arterial, state secondaries, and urban and municipal. And that's all separate. That is all our rehab and our reconstruction type projects. And then we have a separate category altogether that is preservation. So we can look at that. We can look at what we have programmed, for preservation for about 2 years out. But then we also have it to where we can look at in the future with different runs, different scenarios with our preservation, we have it split out so that we have our major, our rehabs, reconstructions are in one pot of money for use for our models, and then we have our preservation type projects in another pot of money. And by going through and iterating, okay, what if we put an extra $20 million per year into preservation? What kind of projects are going to get kicked out, for the future? What kind of projections are we going to see because these projects are in there? Or, we reduce preservation funds and we put an additional 30, 40 million in majors. And you could do that. It's fairly quick to look at those different scenarios and see what it's going to do to your overall condition. So I think to kind of wrap that up, we can look at that, and I guess depending on sophistication of your model, how those effects can be in the future. And just the way we have things set up with our STIP, we can track in the near future and in the past what kind of impacts we've had by the type of projects we have.
Thanks. Getting back to the ultra thins, we've got some experience with those. We found they don't maintain the friction real well, and I'm just curious if you guys are having success with them. How are you doing that? Are you using better aggregate? Did you tweak the gradation? We limit the use to the lower easel categories for that reason.
We don't do a lot of dense graded super pave, what I would call a thin lay. We do place ultra thin bonded wearing course Nova chip. We had a similar problem with it. We allowed all limestone for a while, and we had some polishing and skid number issues. So we do have, I don't know off the top of my head, it's something like 45% of the course aggregate has to be, or +8 material, something like that, has to come from a non-limestone source. So we call it a primary aggregate requirement.
We have requirements for the aggregate that goes into those mixes, but I have not tracked the friction numbers on that, so I can't answer that.
In Minnesota, our aggregates are very good quality, so I don't think it's an issue. I do remember that when we did one of our very first ultra-thin bonded wearing course pavements, and we sent our friction trailer down there, and we have both ribbed and smooth on there, that the ribbed was a little lower than we might have expected on a newer dense graded hot mix, but the smooth tire actually was a point or two higher than the ribbed, which really we had never seen in the history of testing. So the ultra thin does dissipate water really nice and has good friction as your tires get a little smoother there. So I would say that friction has not been a problem.
We have friction requirements based on ADT for all of our mixtures, even the ultra thin bonded. So we try and address the friction issue in the design.
I didn't ask my question well. Not ultra thin bonded wearing course. What we have the presentation on.
Oh, the thin lays. I gotcha. All right. So, yeah, we've only built one thin lay and it blistered up on us, so.
I think I do remember we built a 975 millimeter mix up at Minroad, and I thought the friction on that was very high, unexpectedly high or good. And maybe as smooth as it was, it had a nice little bite to tire, so.
All right, I think that concludes our panel session. So thank you guys for all of your well-awarded answers, and thank you all for your participation.
The preceding was produced by the National Center for Pavement Preservation. More information can be found on the web at pavementpreservation.org. Additional support provided by Michigan State University.